Political Geography, Geography Unit 5, Video 1. To get started, let's look at some commonly mistaken terms in reference to political geography. In a world of states, the world is divided into nearly 200 states. All but a handful of these states belong to what we call the United Nations. Let's clarify these terms. First of all, a nation is a group of people with shared characteristics, such as a language, that have no boundary. An example here are Spanish speakers. They live all over the world, and there are no geographic boundaries that hold Spanish speakers. They're in several countries around the world. In contrast to that, a state is an area organized into a political unit and ruled by an established government that has control over its internal and foreign affairs. A state occupies a defined territory on the Earth's surface and contains a permanent population. If we put those two together, we get what's called a nation-state. A nation-state is one whose territory corresponds to that occupied by a particular ethnicity that has been transformed into a nationality. We'll go through some examples here to clarify those definitions. Nations are common identities among its people. For example, Palestine. Palestinians do not have a state, they do not have an independent country of their own. However, they have a national identity, a common language, a common culture, common heritage, etc. Most Palestinians live within Israel, however, they do not have a state. In contrast to that, a state is a self-governing political entity, such as Hong Kong or the United States. They are an independent political government that controls their own affairs. In the middle is what we get nation-states. Their political and ethnic commonalities are shared. An example here is Denmark. The people of Denmark are considered Danish, and they share a language that is common to their heritage. So their political boundaries largely match that of their nationality. They are a good example because they share a approximately 50-mile boundary with Germany, but Germany does not divide the Danish and the German ethnic groups precisely. There are people who speak German on the Danish side, and there are Danish who speak German. So we have a mix of those two things. The boundaries aren't always perfect. Another example here of a nation is the Kurdish people. The Kurdish people live in an area that's commonly called Kurdistan. However, Kurdistan is not a state. It is a nation. It is made up of an ethnic group of people who share a common background. There are approximately 30 million people who consider themselves Kurds living in Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, and other Middle Eastern countries. They have a very common language, a common culture, common religion, etc., and so they're considered an enclave within the Middle East. Another example of a nation-state was that of Nazi Germany during World War II. The Nazis unified all German-speaking people in various areas around Europe, creating a nation-state. Hopefully those examples have clarified that terminology for you. The next example that we need to look at in reference to political geography are the boundaries of states. States have different types of boundaries, and those boundaries must be well defined in certain regions. A state is separated by its neighbors by a boundary, which is an invisible line marking the extent of the state's territory. There's two main types of boundaries. Physical boundaries are the ones we'll start with. Desert, mountain, and water. Desert boundaries make an effective boundary because they're hard to cross and they're sparsely inhabited. Mountain boundaries can be effective boundaries because they're also difficult to cross. It can easily separate one group from another, especially if that boundary is impassable during winter. And finally, water boundaries, such as rivers, lakes, and oceans, they're commonly used because they're really visible on maps, and also it provides a natural barrier of invading armies. Some examples of physical boundaries are those in the United States, such as the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River forms a border between Minnesota and Wisconsin, between Iowa and Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, etc., etc. It serves as a natural physical border. There's several other examples of physical boundaries here in the United States. However, we'll move on to the next category of boundaries. Those are called cultural boundaries. Within cultural boundaries, there are two types. There are geometric boundaries, which are straight lines on maps, and then there are ethnic boundaries, which separate ethnic groups. I'll show you an example here. A geometric boundary is the boundary between the United States and Canada. It is approximately 1,300 miles, and it's a straight line along a map, along the 49th parallel of latitude, running from Minnesota all the way to Washington State and between that and British Columbia. So that is a geometric boundary. A good example of an ethnic boundary are those that are placed where possible to separate language groups, such as those in Europe. Europe was largely created in the most recent map after World War II to separate language families. The French generally speak French, the Germans generally speak German, so on and so forth. So it is important to note that the boundaries of states correlate to those states and their commonalities. Each state has what we call sovereignty. Sovereignty means that there is control of its internal affairs without interference from other states. So here we have an example of Kosovo. Kosovo is a relatively new nation. It declared its independence in 2008 from Serbia. This declaration of independence followed ethnic cleansing and war crimes by some Serbian leaders. The United States and most other European countries recognize Kosovo as a sovereign or independent state from Serbia. However, Serbia, Russia, and most countries in Africa and Asia do not recognize Kosovo as an independent country, leading to questions about its true sovereignty. The United States, of course, has sovereignty. It is independent from other countries, such as Great Britain. We gained our independence back in 1776. But within the United States, each state, such as Minnesota, Iowa, or Wisconsin, has limited sovereignty or limited independence from the national government. That's why, for example, in Minnesota, we do not have sales tax on clothes, whereas in Wisconsin they do. That's exercising some level of sovereignty. Within each state, there are certain issues regarding the politics of each state. In the United States, we'll specifically focus on our own country as it makes most sense to us, and we're going to focus and look at something in reference to government representation, redistricting. So hopefully you remember back from each state has the national government has 435 members in the House of Representatives, which is a governing body for the entire country. Congress has 435 seats. Those 435 seats are based on the population divided among the 50 states. So California carries the most weight because they have the greatest population. In Minnesota, we have enough population to gather 8 seats. And because we have 8 seats, that means we have to have 8 separate districts in Minnesota to represent our political makeup. According to the 2010 census, we got data showing where each person in the state of Minnesota lives. In order to make sure that our districts are even, we needed to redistrict or redraw the political boundaries within our state. The process of redistricting is the process of drawing electoral or voting boundaries. This is purely based on population. It's a very political process. Oftentimes, this can result in what we call gerrymandering. Gerrymandering occurs when electoral districts are created to favor one political party. We will spend a day looking at redistricting and gerrymandering in reference to understanding how political geography can sometimes be abused by those in power. The state of Minnesota, as you can see from this map, has 8 different congressional districts, each district represented by one person at the national government. So District 1, where you live down here in Olmsted County, is represented by one person, which is different than the person who is represented in District 2, so on and so forth. The districts are not divided based on land mass, rather the districts are divided up based on population. So we can see that District 5 here, blown up here, includes most of Minneapolis in Hennepin County. The district is very small when it comes to land mass, however, it contains the same number of people as does District 8 and does District 7 because it is based on population. This map shows all 435 congressional districts within the United States. So as we can see, North Dakota and South Dakota have just one congressional district each, as their population is so small that it only warrants enough to have one seat of Congress. Every state in the country is allowed at least one member of Congress. We see that Illinois is much more heavily populated than Minnesota, and so therefore it has numerous districts related to its population in those regions, clustered, of course, around Chicago. Outside of each state, sometimes states try to attempt to exercise their political power in what we call colonialism. Colonialism should be something that's very familiar to you. Colonialism's purpose is usually three parts: God, glory, and gold. Those things are commonly defined as spreading the religion of the colonizer, gaining prestige for the colonizer, and extracting resources for the colonizing country. When a state takes or settles another to impose its political, economic, and cultural power, that is an excellent definition of colonialism. India is a great example of colonialism. The British colonized India in approximately 1600, and India did not gain its independence until 1947. The British extracted tea, spices, and cotton from British India and left India with a strong heritage towards the English language, towards sports such as football, as well as cricket, which are still lasting in India today. In contrast, state power also manifests itself outside of its boundaries in imperialism. Imperialism is the idea behind the practice of colonialism. So as imperialism is the theory and colonialism is generally the practice. Imperialism is more strongly related to military and economic exploitation rather than spreading cultural values. So as we can see, the European powers in 1914 divided up Africa into different territories, each controlled by a different European power. So we can see that most of West Africa was controlled by the French, and we see that today one of the major languages spoke throughout Western Africa is the French language still to this day. So those imperial and colonialist powers have lasting effects long after the colonizers leave the political state and it becomes independent. European colonization of Africa occurred for a long period of time. As we can see, each of these dates indicates when each country gained its independence from its colonial power. We can see some of them were as late as the 1960s or even 1975 when Angola gained its independence from Portugal. So there are lasting effects of colonialist and imperialist rule in Africa that we still see happening today. Sometimes nationalities don't necessarily match the borders. We'll go back to the example of Kurdistan. Kurdistan is not an actual place. It's a general region or a nation of people who share the common characteristics of Kurds. Kurdistan is an area where the Kurdish nationality, language, and culture reside. It entails about 30 million people in the Middle East. They're mainly Sunni Muslim. However, they don't have their own independent state. They function within different states, which have very different rules. When states decide to cooperate with one another, they often sign what we call treaties. A treaty is an agreement among sovereign or independent powers, independent states, to cooperate with one another. Treaties can take the form of economic, political, or military alliances. One of the most common military alliances is NATO, or the Warsaw Pact. This map shows NATO countries in blue that are countries that belong to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that have vowed to protect one another in times of crisis. The Warsaw Pact was created by the Soviet Union during the Cold War to balance NATO's effects. There are also economic treaties, such as that of the European Union or of NAFTA, to encourage cooperation among independent or sovereign states. Sometimes there are often political treaties, such as between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, to share resources and even governments. We'll be spending some time looking at what we call the Fragile States Index. The Fragile States Index is a nonprofit ranking of 178 countries based on 12 indicators that you will learn about independently in class. Those indicators are social, political, as well as economic indicators. Out of these rankings, they rank each country to determine how fragile or stable each nation is. In 2015, the most fragile nations are, in this order, South Sudan, Somalia, the Central African Republic, the Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Fragile States Index is a good indicator of political stability in reference to geographic boundaries and regions around the world.